So, where exactly is the line between your digital privacy and national security? I really want you to consider for a second where your Fourth Amendment rights end and the government's mandate to prevent catastrophic terrorism actually begins. Because in our highly connected world, that line isn't just getting a little blurry, it is being completely redrawn from scratch.
Today, we're diving into an explainer on a massive, fundamental shift in national security. We're talking about the evolution from physical militia threats to digital lone wolf actors and the intense, everyday legal friction this creates between state surveillance and your personal liberty.
Here's a quick roadmap of what we're going to cover. We'll start with the modern extremist threat, move into technologically facilitated terror, break down federal legal tripwires, examine the privacy versus surveillance tension, and finally look at the risks of systemic failure.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the modern extremist threat. We're looking at the shift from organized militias to lone wolf actors.
Just look at this statistic. It's honestly staggering. According to the Global Terrorism Index, a massive 93% of fatal attacks in the West over a recent 5-year period were carried out by lone offender actors. I mean, that is a dramatic pivot away from organized, hierarchical groups toward isolated individuals who are being radicalized entirely online. You know, experts actually have a name for this new decentralized threat. They call it salad bar terrorism, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Just like picking ingredients from a buffet, today's extremists aren't adhering to one strict, rigid ideology. Instead, they're pulling from a customized, personalized mix of political and social grievances. And because it's fueled by algorithms, this radicalization timeline has shrunk from taking years down to mere weeks. But hey, this isn't just an online problem. Militia violent extremists like the Oath Keepers and Three Percenters pose a very real physical threat. They're deliberately targeting critical infrastructure like power grids. Now, add in the ideological overlap with groups like Sovereign Citizens, plus the incredibly alarming fact that minors now make up 42% of North American terror investigations. To put that in perspective, nearly half of these cases are kids. You can absolutely see why authorities are on such high alert. Moving right along to Section 2, technologically facilitated terrorism, or the digital front lines of extremism. The really scary thing here is that modern digital platforms are completely borderless, which means adversaries are no longer constrained by geography. A bad actor sitting in their bedroom can now weaponize dark web infrastructure for legal financing, use AI data centers to run covert reconnaissance, or even deploy commercial drones to execute remote attacks. They are entirely bypassing traditional community safeguards. It's literally a whole new battlefield. Which brings us to Section 3, federal legal tripwires. We're going to look at material support and the criminalization of intent. So, how does the government fight an invisible digital threat? Well, they use strict federal laws that criminalize intent before any violence actually occurs. And the crucial distinction to understand here is between two specific statutes. Under Section 2339A, the government has to prove specific intent, meaning they have to prove you knew your support would cause a terrorist act. But under Section 2339B, they only need to prove you knew a group was a designated foreign terrorist organization. You could literally be trying to help them build an orphanage. If you give them material support, you're facing up to 20 years in prison. It's a massive anticipatory net. But wait, what actually counts as support? Well, this is where the legal tripwires get incredibly controversial. Take expert advice or assistance, for example. In landmark cases, courts have actually ruled that advising a designated group on peaceful conflict resolution counts as material support. It creates this really slippery slope where constitutionally protected speech and even humanitarian work run the risk of being heavily penalized without any physical link to actual violence. Let's look at Section 4, privacy versus surveillance tension. How exactly does the Fourth Amendment hold up in the digital age? As you can imagine, the courts are really struggling to keep up here, constantly having to redefine what makes a government search unreasonable. It all started with wiretaps and the Katz ruling, which established the reasonable expectation of privacy. Later, the Kylo ruling decided that pointing a thermal imaging camera at a house counts as a search. But more recently, in cases involving bulk metadata, like ACLU Clopper, courts found that if you share data with a third party, like your cell phone provider, you basically lose your expectation of privacy. So as authorities deploy better and better sense-enhancing tech, the boundaries of your private life just continue to shrink. Finally, Section 5, systemic failure and misclassification, focusing on a case study from the Democracy Archive. To see how the real-world friction of these powerful legal frameworks actually plays out, we're going to look at claims from a forensic repository known as the Democracy Archive. Now, it's vital to note we are simply impartially reporting the author's claims here to illustrate a broader point about the system. The archive claims that state intelligence hubs use automated algorithms to generate risk profiles, and that these systems can produce devastating false positives. The author specifically argues that their own academic research on security trends was completely misinterpreted by local authorities as actual terrorist threat indicators. The author outlines what they call a competency loop, and it's a pretty intense three-step claim. First, they claim predictive policing bias causes a misclassification, escalating a routine dispute into a major felony charge. Next, the state allegedly uses medical competency evaluations as a shortcut to just bypass standard evidentiary hearings altogether. And this alleged suspension of due process leads directly to step 3, severe administrative fallout. We're talking prolonged pretrial detention, retaliatory eviction, and just total economic destabilization for the individual. Then there's this fascinating theory the archive proposes, called the Medina connection. The author notes that their own personal travel timeline perfectly and unfortunately clustered with major global terror attacks, from 9/11 to Madrid to London. Because they happened to be traveling through primary global transit hubs during these really turbulent eras, they hypothesized that their assigned IP address was covertly flagged and repurposed as a digital tracking node, entirely without their knowledge. Building on that hypothesis, the archive presents claims that the author's personal devices were actively exploited. They present claims of unauthorized data routing and unexplainable digital footprints showing their home network was compromised. Furthermore, the author claims to have experienced technologically mediated assaults, specifically voice-to-skull or V2K harassment, which is a method of beaming audio directly into a person's head. The archive asserts that forensic logs proving this illicit connectivity were systematically ignored by agencies, framing this institutional silence as a profound breakdown of constitutional protections. There's a quote from the archive that I think really hits the nail on the head regarding their central argument. It says, "A portrait of an individual whose due process was suspended through a low threshold for arrest and a high threshold for investigation." The core argument they're making is that modern institutions, armed with these incredibly broad digital tripwires, default to self-protection and rapid legal escalation, rather than doing objective forensic investigation. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a huge systemic question. As technology fully merges with national security, and as algorithms are increasingly used to predict threats, we really have to ask, how fragile is your own cognitive liberty, and how secure is your digital footprint when it's suddenly placed under the government's microscope? It's something we all absolutely need to be thinking about as these technologies evolve. Thanks for joining me on this one.